Welcome to KIMEcast, where we break through and cut the BS in sports medicine, rehabilitation, and sports performance, and talk about how things really work.
Welcome back to KIMEcast. Russ and Tony, Tony Mikla. We're going to take on this conversation today about looking at programming and how we might program a person's health. And obviously, if we're going to talk about programming, we probably need to start with what's our goals and where is this person starting at as an individual, right? If we don't know where we're going, it's kind of hard to put a good plan together. And number two is if we don't know where we're starting, it's kind of hard to put a good map together. So it really comes down to these variables. So we'll talk about some of the new stuff with testing. It's been all the craze, I think, in this field of sports medicine to use more objective testing, which is great. And we've got everywhere from the 3D motion capture stuff to the catapult systems and the GPS tracking type systems for speed, agility, and total amounts of work volume. And then things like more testing in the clinic might be like force plates or using handheld dynamometers or some version of that to measure force, range of motion, things of that nature. So we were really familiar with these tests and been using them for quite a while in our practice. We've been messing around with using the force plates extensively over the last few years and really found some really good data with it, and kind of we learned a lot over the last couple of years in the way we've used them and what's worked, what hasn't, for sure. Whether it be like not only clinical use, but in large team settings. So we'll bring some of that to the case today. We've also been very familiar with all the catapult systems and stuff out there that's presents so much data. And then once again, just what's your ability to use all this data and how's it going to impact? And what you want to be asking is what's the action that you can take from a testing session or from a data session? How is that going to change your programming? And if you're collecting data that's really not going to impact your programming, then the question should be, why? What are you looking for? Back to great book by John Dower's Measure What Matters. And what's going to move the needle? What's going to change your intention? So I'd say let's go with let's get this rocking with some of the stuff we've done with from a testing standpoint before we get into goals and programming stuff. But let's talk about testing and what we're looking at. I think we're looked at putting our athletes into categories, and there's a couple subcategories. But the big categories would be: is the person how do they move? Are they a hypermobile athlete? Are they a stiff athlete or a hypermobile athlete overall? Is there a lack of mobility anywhere, which we know has some increased injury risk? The NFL has put out the data in the past that your biggest risk of injury is going to be lack of hip flexion, lack of hip internal rotation. That's what they see from a non-contact injury standpoint is their highest risk of injury. Despite all of the data that they get out of the combine and working with these athletes, that's actually the data that holds the strongest non-contact injury prediction ratings.
Is hip flexion, hip internal rotation, and then the third one would be ankle dorsiflexion.
Yeah. So they come down to mobility tests. So we use mobility as one category of athletes. If you're missing some of these mobilities, those are key things we want to get you working on. And we obviously incorporate a lot of those into dynamic warm-ups and stuff of all of our athletes. But if you're lacking it might be a little bit higher focus, higher drive. And then a category of athlete that's more strength-based, where we need to increase a hypertrophy phase or just strength foundation, just raw strength, which we certainly see in our youth athletes is probably their primary need, primary driver. So we'll do quite a bit of work with those guys. But we might see them in other athletes as well that are relatively an untapped talent or an uncoached talent, where you might see in any sport, frankly, but certainly maybe one that has less weight room associations to it, something like tennis or something of that nature. We'll see quite a bit. And then, of course, you've got your power folks, which everybody wants. Everybody wants to be the most powerful, wants to have the highest vertical, wants to throw the ball the hardest, wants to, jump the furthest. And all those are power metrics, and everybody wants that. That's the closest thing to performance. Of course, there's questions about sustainability there. And if you don't have the first two, the mobility or the power or the strength, then power becomes dangerous. We could become overpowered and things of that nature. So to do this, we've been looking at how can we consolidate a testing program, an assessment program for our athletes that would get us the information we need to determine who is the athlete in front of us. What are they good at? What are they not so good at? How can we quickly assess this in just a few minutes? Is there technology available to do that for us? And we found that using these force plate systems is probably the best tool for that we can get really so much information from this in a very quick period of time. Wouldn't you say so, Russ?
Yeah. Well, I think we've evolved a lot with the test. I think when I was studying this, it was kind of just like just jump on it and see what the power reading is. But now, looking at the battery of tests, we went from a company called Vald out of Australia to now recently a company called Hawken Dynamics out of Maine, and local to United States. And they've been a really fun group because they have a massive education component to how they bring out testing on a force platform specifically. So our battery of tests from kind of our first test to our last test goes from a counter movement jump, a counter movement rebound jump, a squat jump, and then a multi-rebound jump, which we could do with 2 legs or 1 leg, but we're preferring, I think, to do it to a single leg. A drop jump, so that you can jump off of a box, and again with either 2 legs or 1 leg. And then a drop landing, which you step off a box and see how quickly you can kind of get to a stabilized position off of 1 leg. And then the 2 strength measures would be an isometric belt squat or an isometric deadlift for the lower body, and then the ASH test, which is common to do at 180 degrees, 135, 90, and 0. We're kind of picking the 90 degrees. So that's kind of like our full battery, which is I think it's a fairly common battery within the Hawken Dynamics battery test. We didn't invent that battery. It's pretty much doing all the tests that they highly recommend. It's a very smart group that has helped with the education process of trying to understand, are we testing power? Are we testing elasticity? Are we testing strength? And what is the skill of the mover? And you can judge the skill by how well they're using the stretch shortening cycle, or how well they recoil their body. So we put together some ranges of what's good, medium, bad. What are the measures to shoot for, judged by literature, and what are some safety aspects to look at from a left to right disturbance, particularly with the spring-like correlation. That's a really interesting thing I want to get into. But that's the battery of tests, and I'm starting to think. I think maybe a year or 2 ago, when I was really kind of first going into the force platforms, I was thinking maybe just like 1 or 2 tests to kind of look at lower body power. But now I'm seeing the versatility, and it's almost like the deeper you go, the more tests you want to do. Because the coolest thing is it takes like 2 seconds to do a test. So we could do 3 jumps, 3 bounds, 3 drops. We barely scratched 60 seconds. If the person knows what they're doing, you could capture a lot of phenomenal data about power, elasticity, strength, asymmetry very quickly with if you're properly set up and the tester knows what they're doing.
Yeah, it's really cool at the speed you can get information. I think there's a couple of variables there to always consider too if you guys are taking this on or starting to work with it is, what's the likely reproducibility of the test? There's a learning curve to some degree when you ask someone to do a jump movement or whatever the movement might be. There's always a learning curve to that, especially working with a younger athlete population. Like when we test our college guys, like they step up to this and it's not a problem at all. They just get it, they go. Some of our high school athletes are very maybe amateur to this type of technology, and so they have this type of clarity in the coaching and what we want them to do. So, and they frankly just may not listen quite as well as some others. So it's you do have to make sure you get good directions and get a good test. But then once that's established, then the ability to retest is really, really quick and really rapid. There's some other cool stuff too that we don't do as much in our environment because we're not usually with a team in this way, but there's some really great stuff on looking at recovery abilities, looking at using it. You could use it in the rehab setting as well as far as return back to sport progressions and clears, which we also do. But it's really been fun. I think what we've learned is this need to do multiple tests of the battery so that you can really start to look at some different variables, right? So can we look at something like what's a true strength that you're able to produce versus, how fast can you produce that strength? And what's your reactive ability? How elastic are you? Are you a springier type athlete, or are you a little bit more of a slower mover, a little less spring? Maybe don't use, like as Russ said, how well do you use your stretch shortening cycle? It can be identified in this which we found is really interesting. Like as clinicians, we'll work with an athlete and you'll watch an athlete do a jump and do a few movements and we'll be like, that guy's super bouncy, super springy. And you can kind of just tell, like, all right, that's a guy that maybe looking at his whole spectrum, I just have a feeling or I just have a sense in looking at him, or I could do some objective tests in the past and say, like, okay, this guy needs to get stronger because he's already very, very bouncy. He's very efficient with using the system. But this tool basically just brings that out for you. So if you didn't have the experience to visualize that or see it, if you knew how to use this tool and how to read the data, you would be able to be like, oh, that guy's already springy. I should be doing something different to make him more dynamic, or how we can teach him how to use that springiness to his best advantage.
I think referencing as a pivot, Dr. Keith Barr's work at UC Davis speaks really highly of tendon qualities. And if we can extrapolate the tendon quality of really the connective tissue's quality of storing energy. And it was Keith Barr that really kind of first brought the word jerk to mind. He looked at the tendon or the connective tissue jerk quality, which is different than a strength quality. He would describe the strength quality to be a force elasticity curve of the tendon that allows it to be compliant with that strength, where the jerk quality is how well can the spring tighten. You could think of it as a stiffness rating, but can it appropriately stiffen, which still means dampen the force, but dampen it in a timely way so that you get maximum propulsive activity. So when you jump or move or you cut, you have a braking force. Can the tendon system quickly grab that energy from braking, propel it into propulsion, and you get a great preservation of braking to propulsion phase. And the preservation of that energy gives you a good spring, but it is a taut spring. It is a finely tined spring. And he would say that if it's too jerky, you're about to strain tendons. And if it's too compliant, you won't have good force. So there's kind of this back and forth nature that our bodies have to adapt to between a strong tendon that's compliant and then a jerk-like tendon that performs really well. And with Hawken Dynamics, with the force platform software that they employ, we're able to kind of get that measured pretty nicely, and they actually call it a great phrase. They just say it's a spring-like correlation. In the definition of the spring-like correlation, if you can kind of bear with me, I know it's kind of hard to listen to this, but the timing between where the center of mass drops, so when you do a jump, how your center of mass drops, that time standpoint of when you are at the lowest position compared to the timing of when you are done braking your body and you vertically push into the ground to start propelling yourself. So those two data points, those two time points are different. The closer they are, the more your spring is a perfect spring. If it was possible that it was that the timing of your center of mass drop was at the exact moment that you propel out and push into the ground and you give that vertical force going up. If that was possible, you'd have a direct one-to-one of those two time points, which is a gold standard of a perfect spring. And in reality, we have a little delay. That's the old school word for that. The way I learned it back in grad school 20 years ago was the amortization phase. It was the phase of that transition time between braking and propulsion. They call that amortization. And you wanted to reduce that time to be more like a spring. Now we have a freaking number, and we can just tell athletes, that's your number. It's pretty cool.
And if your number is closer to 1, they actually it's a negative number because of the way they do the math, but if it's negative 0.8, you're just okay. If it's negative 0.9, you're pretty good. If it's in between 0.9 and negative 1, you got a good spring. And then back to, let's say the athlete scored below like a 0.8, so their spring-like correlation wasn't very good. Then that would encourage us to be able to doing things to help them reduce their amortization phase, reduce this pause period, and they have a bit of spring-like effect, which may be more things like drop jumps or more pogos type movements where they're very, very short on the ground, where you're challenging the athlete to get off the ground quickly. Can you load and then get off the ground quickly as really the main cues? Versus like a box jump would be an example of something that's probably not going to change the amortization phase that much, would be my assumptions, because you're jumping from a flat surface up onto a box. Now, obviously, when you jump, you have to decel and then accelerate to get out of it. I get all that, but it's not quite putting the same load on this particular mechanism.
I think that's exactly the point to it. I think the challenge that we have, the challenge everyone should have in this space is looking at a 14-year-old versus a 16-year-old versus an 18-year-old versus a pro. And there's a lot to be said for the central nervous system. I think we're kind of pretending that this is a tendon quality or a connective tissue quality, but it's also guided by the nervous system. So yeah, it is a judge of how effective the person uses their body like a spring. And that's probably tied to how strong they are and how old they are, how long they've been working with their body and what sport they're doing. And are they rebounding on a stiff surface a lot, or are they a swimmer or a sand volleyball athlete or an MMA athlete, that they do a lot of like rotation. They don't kind of like bounce in the ground like an elite sprinter. So I think there's a lot of questions that come up of whether or not what's the right goal and how to influence that. But this is definitely, I think, a key variable of elasticity.
I think it's interesting, just some anecdotal data, the information. So I've been training my son's basketball team. They're all 13-year-olds, and they play basketball amongst baseball and some other sports. And so he is very genetically similar to I am, which is not superior in the sports world, just so that we're clear. His elasticity leaves a little to be desired, for sure. But his strength is quite good. So he's probably the strongest guy in the group, but his elasticity is not awesome. So it's funny. So he loads himself pretty well, and as does most of the group. He doesn't usually get sore, just as a anecdotal feedback. But twice now I've put in pretty extensive like plyometric days where we're doing something like you used to do with TJ, where you're jumping over a hurdle and then onto a box, and it's like multiple spring leg jumps, like 2 or 3 in a row. Some of them are depth jump in nature, some of them box jump in nature, some of them hurdle jumps in nature. And it's like boom, 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 boom. They do like 6 in a row, and then next guy's up in a row, whatever. But I've done that to him twice, and both times he can barely walk the next day.
Well, what part? Was it like everything? Or what did he point to?
Not the knees. No, it's the thigh, like his quad,
that's
his glutes. It's actually in the muscle tissue, which I think is interesting because all the talk about tendons, like we're speaking of.
Yeah.
As that's the communication system, I think, and certainly it has to have tensile strength. But he has had some on and off knee pain with some growth over the last few months, but it doesn't seem to be at all relevant to the workouts. Very relevant to like how much time we're on the court, but as far as the workouts in the gym, doesn't seem to have any impact on his knees at all.
I mean, this goes back to what we said on the previous podcast of like what are the rocks to move, and how does the body solve? What's the problem to solve too? And I think the younger someone is, the more I think play-like I tend to get, because I feel like that's how the body was supposed to learn. It's going to be guided by power, by you demanding more power. I think jumping and bounding and running over stuff and jumping over stuff and challenging your ballistic nature with the problem to solve. I want to go from here to there with the least amount of jumps. I want to get that high. I want to get over that. And that's how I think young people respond really well. I always think there's a role for strength, but I think sometimes we can shortcut ourselves by not having a young person still answer the question of how do I get my body more powerful by ballistically moving in this way. It can never not be a part of a young person's solution if they just live in the weight room and only do slow things. But yeah, you're teaching them to be a lineman. Yeah. It's just not.
It's about speed, no doubt about it. I think on that note, it's always good. I want to say 2 things there, just so we're clear. Like one on jumping, I hate whatever it is, just from my own experience, having athletes jump over hurdles. Like I don't mind if it's a 12-inch hurdle, but it starts to become like a 24-inch hurdle or a 30-inch hurdle. Because I think the risk reward goes away at that point. Because I've seen too many athletes being in rehab that catch a foot on there, tear an ACL or something, and they're out for a year because of the training, which is the worst thing we can do. So that's something I'm very, very careful of, is jumping over like track hurdles because they're so fixed and they don't knock down quite as
they're
easily.
hard, they're thick, you can, there's
We've
no
got
falling gracefully over them.
Exactly. If you had a pliable, like a bungee cord you're jumping over, or like the FMS is a simple like tube type of a thing. Things of that nature I think are phenomenal. Or lower hurdles below 18 inches is really a non-issue, but as they get higher, it's one thing to consider. But I've always been impressed, and never when I was younger did I really to understand it, but watching athletes over the years go through these training programs of jumping on really, really high boxes is a really tremendous motivation, to your point. Like boxes that are waist height or chest height, and having an athlete get on top of that box strictly by jumping again, their legs knee to chest and laying in a squat. I've seen it time and time again. I'm like, there's no way that guy's getting on the box. I'm like, oh shit, he's on the box. Had me fooled. I mean, it's like, damn, like that's freaking awesome.
It's kind of one of those things that it's like a little scary, but if you miss it and it's a softer box, you just kind of land with your shins on it. You kind of knee it. I had a high box that my kids, they wanted me to build it really high. I got littles, so I had a 7 and a 9-year-old, and I put it like my height, and they kind of like tried to do one of those running jump, and they didn't mind because it was kind of soft, and they they kind of scampered on it a little bit. But the point is, I think jumping on the stuff that's on the softer end, obviously not like a hard edge, that I think it's one of the best tools of a gym is to get those soft boxes. You can do depth jumps, single leg, split. You can go low, kind of pogo style with like a 4-inch one. You can challenge the athlete. I've been regularly myself doing like single leg jumps, or I'll even do a frog-like jump with one leg, where I touch the ground while I'm on one leg and then jump up. But you can get a lot of creative ways to be explosive, and if you miss it, it doesn't matter because you just land your shin on a soft box like no big deal.
Yeah, I still have a mark on my shin from high school.
from a wooden box,
a 12-inch wooden box. No, I think it was a 24-inch wooden box, but it's still there. And that was a moment of love and infamy for me. That was so painful, it was insane. And I've seen that happen to other kids too with a wooden box. I'm full on with you. Probably the most expensive thing you could buy in your gym is those stackable boxes. They're insane. Now they make the cubes, which is fantastic, but still, they're still fairly pricey for those things. But I know Titan Fitness makes one that's more affordable. It's pretty cool. But nonetheless, I think, so we got this idea of running through the gamut of testing, this battery of testing, getting an idea of maybe what's their spring-like correlations. And then obviously you start choosing from what plyometrics you want to do as how you would program that. So I think one of the big things that we've looked at here is a couple different variables to try to determine, like, is it a strength situation, or is it a power move, and put these tests in maybe some different categories.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with strength, we can obviously talk about lower body strength, upper body strength. But with the lower body strength, we kind of have, two options. You kind of squat something or hinge something. And we've done, hundreds, if not maybe more than that, like 1,000 isometric deadlifts. And it always kind of, bothered me to see this, because I knew that if someone didn't have a good grip, that was going to be a limiting factor. Mm-hmm. Now, it tests the full body strength for sure, but it's also a very hard test. And there's definitely a certain population where it's going to bias them a bit unfairly. So the majority of ladies, their grip will not be that of the guys. And but yet, many women have relatively great lower body strength. So they're not going to be tested well with a deadlift, with an isometric deadlift. And that's what the research shows. The research shows that there's a lot of variability in the deadlift pull for the ladies, as not nearly as reliable as a belt squat. And the belt squat, you hook the belt to the hips, squat it isometrically, get the knee at 90 degrees. And that seems to be the gold standard if we're going to look at one test to rule them all for lower body strength, both men and women.
And then for upper body strength, we're using the ASH at the moment. We've gone back and forth with using like different types of handheld dynamometers and sets here to try and get a strength measurement. And it's still, I think there's a gap here as far as like what's the best tool to use, what's available. I think the dynamometers have some good things, and I mean, I like external rotation with it is fairly good. We've done an external rotation at the side. We've done it at 90 degrees in supine position. In both cases, they're pulling on the dynamo. We use the Vol dynamo in this case. In both cases, they had a pull on it, and it works pretty good. I don't like using the dynamometer when you're pushing against it. Like if you push and they push, because then there's two variables happening at the same time. So if you are going to have them push against something, I think it needs to be against a wall or something that's solid and stabilized. So keep that in mind. But then also remember that what the athlete's doing, they're going to be hesitant to push a certain amount of force. They don't want to break the thing. Like that actually goes through these people's heads. So when you're cueing the activity, you want max effort, max force production, so you can look at relative thresholds, because you don't know if someone's doing 50, 60, 80%. So you got to coach it to be like max effort, let's go all out, and then give them an environment that they feel really stable, they can go all out in, and then feel like they can get a safe reading. So if we can do that well, then we can get good information. But more recently, we've moved to trying out the ASH test and doing more with the ASH. But instead of doing every version of the ASH, it's kind of locking in more at 90 degrees for the moment and seeing, can we go and get some upper body strength measurements of looking at the ASH at 90.
Yeah, it's a fairly recent test. So it just started in 2018 with a paper published out of the UK called the Athletic Shoulder. And then they did this both in the I, T, Y, and I position. So 0 degrees, 90 degrees, 135, and 180. And we kind of settled on 90 purely off of repeatability, because if you try and test 100 athletes from 5'6" to 6'7", it's not like you can just put some tape on the ground and call it a day. You're constantly having to change people's angles and probably actually measure them, because if you do this test, you'll quickly realize the difference between 90 degrees and 135 is fairly significant in the force you're able to put. You're able to put a lot more force because of the angle. And if you change from 135 to 130 or 125, you're going to get weird data. If I test the right arm at 135 and I test the left arm at 125, that's going to be significantly different just based on the biomechanics of the body. So from a reliability standpoint of making sure that we're testing what we think we're testing the right side on the left side on the same standard, it was just far easy just to call it a 90-degree angle. Almost anyone can kind of eyeball that pretty nicely. 135, you can't eyeball. Very few people can hit 180 in period. And to do it at 0 is a bit of a funky position. So I think the 90 makes the most sense. If you're going to have a shoulder problem, that one probably will expose it. The only issue to me here is we are testing a horizontal adduction. You're prone on the ground with your arm at 90 degrees with your palm facing down. So although I think very applicable for a lot of throwing sports, the question in my mind that I'm not in love with, but just throwing it out there is, we're looking at the external rotators as the decelerators of the shoulder when you're in a throwing motion. And we're seeing that there is an ER problem for problem shoulders. So we do dynamometer, do a ER 9 at 0 degrees here, and we see, you have a 20% deficit left to right. I think that you're going to find that with this ASH test at ASH 90, but it's just interesting because we're testing now horizontal adduction. So it's just a thought. We're trying to, I don't want to say round peg, square hole here, meaning I don't want to force tests on a forced platform that don't belong in a forced platform. So, for a little bit of clarity, in the clinic, we use dynamometers a lot. And we can tease out ER, IR, different positions. We can look at stamina. We can look at stability strength. Can you contract it for 60 seconds or not? We can get very crisp of looking at a full profile of a shoulder. With this type of testing, using a forced platform for an upper body movement, it's interesting, and I think it's a great filter of problems, but I do worry that there's going to be problems that slip through. So I'm really curious to see how this research unfolds that we can put together of saying, can this test find most of the problems?
Yeah, that would be really interesting. So what we're looking to do is, when working with like a team, so we might have a team of baseball guys or soccer or whatever the sport might be, and obviously maybe with soccer and some of your low extremity sports, this is not so critical, but start bringing in your volleyball athletes and your track throwers, and then maybe your baseball guys, of course. And there's more questions to ask, which of course we handle when we go through a team test. We want to look at their mobility and look at total arc and a variety of other mobility metrics and strength. But when we're saying, what can we do with this system? Can we take an athlete through a force plate testing system in less than 3 minutes and gather all the data we need to be able to program for them? And we're hoping that with this, we can do that. And we're hoping that also we get a little bit of a red flag if somebody's far below a threshold. And then from that red flag, we can then mark them for further testing and break them out too, so we can still reduce injury risk for them and maximize their performances. They might need a little more clarity. So that's what we're looking for. Is there a relationship eventually between this ASH test and perhaps ASH at 90 exclusively and other aspects of shoulder strength? Although we could easily argue that adducting is maybe not so related to external rotation. There's, I'm sure, a ratio there, which is Russ's favorite concept, of how much can you press into the adduction plane versus how much can you actually rotate. There might be some value there. We might see some correlations there over time. So we're interested in kind of diving down that path a little bit more.
Yeah, this is a weird pivot, but I worked with a bodybuilder. He was a world-class bodybuilder. He won competitions. He was kind of like the Mr. Olympia type for the fitness type, which meant he only weighed 230 pounds rather than 300 pounds. Anyways, he's a big bodybuilder type, and he was able to horizontally press and horizontally fly a lot of weight. He was putting up, I think he told me, like 120s with a press on each side, so 120-pound dumbbells, bench press, and he was able to fly, I think he told me, like in the 60s or 70s realm. When I tested his rotator cuff strength, it was less than mine. In other words, I'm sure he would have passed the ASH test. And now both of his rotator cuffs were kind of shot from probably years of bench press. But you know, that's but both shoulders were a little shot. But I imagine he would pass this test. So then the question is, what is the success of this test? And we could look at left to right disturbance. Could do a good old fashioned, limb symmetry index, some LSI index or asymmetry, and maybe less than 10 or 15%. You could also look at what is this strength relative to your body weight. The research that was kind of pulled from this is maybe looking at somewhere between 8 and 10% of your body weight. You should be able to surpass your peak force in a 90-degree ASH test. You should be able to surpass 10% of your body weight. But my fear is that someone's going to have still have a shit rotator cuff and be able to pass this test.
Right.
And it won't filter. The test won't filter out the shoulder problem.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we think there's still going to have to be some more clearance here that we apply, but hopefully it can get us a ballpark for sure. Now we've looked at a couple of the jump strategies as well. We talked about doing a counter movement jump versus doing like a squat jump, which the difference between the two, a counter movement means you're dropping down and coming up. Squat jump actually doesn't really exist in the world, but we're kind of making it up as a test there because you can't go down and hold a nice bench position and all of a sudden explode up. Some people are better than others, but it's very, very difficult to do. This might be similar to like a seated box jump or something you might see like in the weight room where you're sitting in the box, feet on the ground, and you're forced to explode up from there. But even getting off the ground in that situation requires usually a lean forward, some sort of forward movement. I was challenged by this by the godfather of plyometrics, Don Chu. Don wrote the book Jumping to Plyometrics. He was a mentor of mine, and I remember doing this in a course earlier on together, and he's like, okay, everybody sit in your chair, and I want everybody to stand up, but you're not allowed to move. You can't lean forward, and you can't move anything else in your body. You just got to stay where you are, sitting straight up tone, and stand. And then, of course, if anyone stood, then they lied to themselves. Was the outcome, right? Because you have to stretch the tissue first for it to contract. It's kind of the nature of plyometrics and the stretch shortening cycle. But there is a quality to how well you use it. There is certainly a difference. Those of you guys who've been around for a while, like think of an athlete like, almost any guy you see that's really twitchy or really springy, you see him in any environment, but could be an American Ninja Warrior, or it could be watching the NBA, it could be watching MMA, any of these different groups where you see somebody who's really explosive, really shifty, if you will, and that's probably a pretty high spring, like a correlated athlete. And someone's a little more of a power athlete that may not have quite that much explosion, might have a little more force behind their movement, maybe a little bit longer amortization phase, maybe a little bit slower through there. But that's one of the tests we could utilize to perhaps see the difference in force production at those different rates, because counter movement jump is going to see at a very fast rate compared to a squat jump.
Yep. That ratio is an interesting one. So I dove in the research a little bit over the weekend on this one. And it's they call it EUR, or the eccentric utilization ratio. And it is just like you said, Tone, it's comparing basically your force or your height. You probably compare both and get the same number, but you compare your force output for a squat jump divided by it's the counter movement jump divided by your squat jump. But it's interesting when I think about this, so like, bobsled team, you start and you take off. You're a lineman. You're in this position. Everyone says go, and you have to propel that person from a static spot. Even like beach volleyball, you're in a low spot, then the ball comes to you and you have to dive to the other side. So there's a lot of like interesting sports that really need you to be like in a position and then you explode out of that position. And that's like a very concentric move. It's a concentric dominant movement. You're in a position and you propel your body. And then the spring, the spring is I'm about to dunk. I take 3 bounds, boing, boing, launch, and I can appreciate how athletics is a mix of people who are elite concentric movers, and then they're elite with the eccentric energy capture and spring. And those people, I think are very different in how we appreciate them. I have a superstar quarterback that I help every week, and I watched him play, and his team went to state. They won it all, and he's a wonderful athlete to work with. His legs are like for 15, 16 years old. His legs are double mine, and I don't have a small leg. He has the biggest leg I've ever seen on a 190-pound kid. And I can appreciate that when he's in a low position and he's looking for a pass as a quarterback, if someone tries to tackle him, he's able to get out of the way so fast because he propels his body probably better than any 15, 16-year-old I've ever seen. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's springy. He's not light. He's got thick tree trunk legs. But because he's so powerful concentrically, I think he can nearly get away from anyone in a moment because he can propel. So it's kind of like one of those qualities of how the squat jump compares to the counter movement jump. I think it is not just sport specific, it's actually position specific. I think it's knowing who you're talking to and what they want out of their body. And that goes back to training. You were trying to solve a problem. What are you solving to? And that should dictate where you spend all your volume with. Do you want to get lighter? For those who are a bit heavier on their feet, maybe they want to get lighter for some reason. But maybe you want to propel harder because you're looking for that first movement. Does that first movement need to be faster and more powerful? And then it's a little bit different. You don't actually need to probably jump. You need to actually explode concentrically over and over and over and over and develop more of that concentric propulsive power. So I as anything, the more I learn, the more questions I have. That's for damn sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great point there. When you're programming or when you're looking at an athlete, one of the big factors that I think we often fail if you're in a weight room or a clinic environment is to take into account like style of play. So if your athlete's style of play is very explosive and very shifty, then they use that a lot, and therefore it's very critical to their effectiveness. And if you're working rehabbing somebody or strength and conditioning somebody, you need to understand that to know how they play the game. So think about there's many examples, but like if you looked at just in the NBA, it's the easiest because we get to see them so often and most people know who they are. But if you watch like the Nuggets, for example, you can see all the same guys on the floor at one time. Like if you look at Aaron Gordon, who's an Arizona alum, for that reason, a phenomenal player. But Aaron is unbelievably springy. I think he's got like a 50-inch vertical or something, 48 something. It's insane. And he's unbelievably quick off the ground. They throw the ball top of the backboard. He goes and gets it. Versus also on the team would be Joker, would be Jokic, and he's not nearly as high off the ground, but he's very powerful and he's very strong, and he's very strong with the ball and strong with his position. If he gets position, he will dominate, but he's not going to beat you in the same ways that Aaron would beat you. And the same thing's true. Like if you looked across the table at like the Milwaukee Bucks right now, you can watch Giannis play or watch Damian Lillard play. They're extremely springy. They're extremely shifty. They can make a move and they'll change direction and go the other direction 5, 6, 8 feet. Like it's unbelievable to see how quickly they can change direction, which makes them so difficult to guard, of course. And they're strong guys. Not to say they're not as concentrically strong, but they're very, very shifty guys. Versus like another guy like Luka Doncic, which is like he plays in slow motion. You're just watching him like he looks like he's walking out there, and he has a little bit of shiftiness, but he's just very, very creative and he's very, very strong. Like once he decides on a position. I watched back in high school, Shaq Thompson. Shaq played at Grant and ended up playing with Carolina for years in the defensive unit in the NFL. And Shaq's a special player. And I remember watching him on the sidelines. They were playing against Folsom. It was like ESPN was doing the games like number 2 against number 4 in the country. And Shaq got hit, I think, at least 8 times, maybe 9 times in the backfield on this sweep left running play. He was running right at me to the left. I was on the sideline. He was running right towards me. He got hit in the backfield 2 or 3 times, just bounced off dudes, and then gets hit 2 more times in the flat, like just stiff arms guys to the ground. I mean, good hits. Like, these kids are putting it on him, right? And then 3 dudes hit him on the sideline and finally get him out of bounds. I'm like, that is the most physical run I've ever seen. And the dude's like a toothpick. Yeah, at this time in high school, he wasn't really necessarily a big guy, but I was so springy and elastic where you touched him, he just like boing, he just bounces enough, boom, cut back the other direction, and like guys are just laying down in the grass, and he's just like, the best part about the whole run is he got knocked down the sideline, literally right next to me, and he got crushed, like hit hard. Guys are full layout here. I mean, this is a physical game, and he hits this kid on the head, and he goes, "Hey, good hit, bro. Good tackle." I'm like, bro, you just got hit like 8 times and you did not go down. I still never saw the ground. The entire Folsom defense is on the floor. I'm like, holy moly. That was when I knew. I was like, okay, there's special people that you see. And
well, I think there's a lot of, speaking to these like super athletes that have a spring-like quality. It's just amazing. Both a good spring and also a powerful spring, as judged by the EUR. The danger comes when they are not strong. And that goes back to testing. Why are we doing this testing? When we put together a performance hierarchy, and the hierarchy goes really similar to our continuum, like move well, then be strong. Be strong, then find speed. Get speed, then find power. And for a lot of athletes, they come like, hey, I want to get more powerful because they think that's what they need. I want to get faster because that's what I'm motivated for. But if we do have a strength issue, and they're not getting it with doing ballistic work, I think some athletes adapt, right? We met that NFL athlete, that starting running back, and he never lifted a damn weight in his whole life and had tree trunks. Some people, they sprint uphill and grow. Others, they sprint uphill, nothing happens. So we have to appreciate that some of us need strength just because of our genetics. We have to do more lunges and split squats and regular front squats and back squats. We have to have a massively progressive load with lower body strength, as judged by the belt squat, but looking at how strong is your belt squat divided by your body weight. For most sports, it should be a relative measure. There's some sports that doesn't really care how relative you are. You need to have an absolute strength component to it. For instance, if you're a lineman, doesn't matter. It matters how strong. You have to be very, very strong to be in a lineman position, plus have some weight too. But the point is being strong first does definitely help, and not all of us adapt to the same stress. Some athletes just need a lot more strength training. Other athletes can get away with not that much strength training because they adapt. And that's a DNA truth that I don't think a lot of people appreciate, because it's awkward to say that. Imagine telling a parent or a kid, you're a poor adapter, so we have to do 500 squats this month. But that's just the truth. It's not like, take emotional baggage aside, that some people need it.
Is this something that DSI can help us with?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk about DSI and RSI and then RFD as well. A couple things. Some of these are good. Some of these maybe we found to be less effective than we hoped for. But so the DSI variable is pretty cool. But you take a lower extremity strength measure, which in some cases is thought of as the mid-thigh pull, which we've used wholeheartedly for probably the last year, and found that the data on it has some variance that kind of has moved us away from that as our gold standard strategy. One, as Russ alluded to, is grip strength, and the second would be the angle of pull they utilize. As an athlete, they tend to lean back against it as opposed to pull vertically, and that creates quite a bit of variability in the data. Russ did his own testing sequence by the way you grip the thing, whether you do closed grip both sides or you do one grip open, one closed. How you move it that way is a big factor. So you can have big variances in data with it. But nonetheless, so now we're using a belt squat as a strength measure, and then we would use counter movement jump as our flight measurement, as our power metric, and then we put one over the other and look at this DSI. And if you're not familiar with DSI, there's kind of the data is basically saying that it's out of a 1 scale, so 0 to 1 is the range, and 0.8 to 1 would be considered that you're kind of, think about you're hitting your ceiling as an athlete. You're generating as much power as you can per unit strength that you have. So you're maximizing your ability. You can't get more explosive. You can't get more powerful because the thinking is that strength is your limiting factor. You already have maximized it out because you're pretty much at a close to 1-to-1 ratio. So anything above 0.8 we consider a more of a power maximization phase or hitting the ceiling. So that athlete has to get stronger. That athlete has to learn how to put on some hypertrophy, build more strength, because by building more strength, it will give them the ability to produce more power, which would have to be trained. But nonetheless, those two, you kind of hit your ceiling there in that group. The 0.6 to 0.8 is kind of your neutral athlete where they have a little bit of both. There's some room for improvement in both categories, but they're fairly well balanced. And then your below 0.6 would be that the athlete is quite strong relative to their power production. So they're not using their strength explosively whatsoever. And so you start thinking about that and say, okay, I see this DSI on this kid. He's got a low DSI. I mean, he's not very powerful compared to how much strength he's producing. And then you need to start to ask the question, okay, what plyometrics should I do with this person? Clearly more plyos is probably indicated because I got to teach him how to use his strength to his advantage. So then what to do? Well, you really need more information is what we've been talking about. So this is where you'd want to do something like, well, is the athlete more springy, or are they going to generate more power in more of a concentric method strategy using the strength that they have? So there's another question there. Most likely this person's going to be concentric just because of the DSI number that you have in front of you. If they were springy, they'd find a way, and they're probably not. So it's probably that group. But we could test that out by doing a rebound type of test. Versus doing a counter movement jump would going to give us that information as well.
Yeah, to kind of put like a little bit of color to what you just said. So if I retell that athlete, if the athlete is able to do a belt squat of say 500 pounds, and then, but they could, if you jump them, they're only jumping with a peak force of 250 pounds. You divide 250 by 500, that's 0.5. So they have all this headroom to be more ballistic. And so for that person, you need to jump them. They're strong enough, jump them. Jump, plyometrics, squat jumps, pogos, jump rope every day, bound uphill, sprint downhill. You have a lot of fun. And then, like, well, how hard do you push? That goes back to what you just said. How spring-like are they? Do they have a shit spring? You need to work on the spring. Do they have good stretch shortening utilization? So those elements are interesting. Now, if that athlete, say that same athlete, 500 pounds of squat strength, and then they have 400 pounds of ballistic power, this person's making a fairly good use of their power. And you have a choice there. So that wouldn't be 0.8. They're kind of right on the edge. Say they were 0.9. Say they had 450 pounds of ballistic strength. Then you want to get stronger, get more headroom. If they're at 350 pounds of strength, again, for that 500-pound squat, they have 350-pound ballistic force in that propulsion phase, then we'd say they're a blended athlete. They're right in the sweet spot. You can kind of do 50% strength, 50% power. Are they in season? Have some fun with it. They're in like a good range. So that's DSI, Dynamic Strength Index.
All right, so it's a good tool. We use that a lot to kind of determine, where is the athlete at and how might you program them. Another tool that's kind of widely discussed is RSI, and there's some data on both sides of the coin here, but probably the differentiator that we've come up with that's most important is going to be moving it to a single leg measurement, right?
Absolutely. It's the reactive strength index. It's your flight time divided by your contact time. And the problem with the RSI in the research is if you have an RSI of 2, that means you're in the air twice as long as you're on the ground. And I have an RSI of 2, you can't really compare us because the quality of my RSI and the quality of yours, we might be equal, but you might be powerful and a shit spring. I might be kind of weaker, but I'm actually using my system really well. And that's what the spring-like correlator tells us. So person between people, this might be one of those, as Hawk and Dynamics would say, it's like a fluff metric. But within the same person, looking at RSI left to right, might be a phenomenal measure. And there is a lot of research, ample research on this, looking at post-ACL reconstruction. This might be our gold standard for return to play after ACL, is your left to right index asymmetry score with RSI. Like that, and that would be a single leg multi-bound hump.
Yeah. we'll just call it a multi-hop because bounty would be jumping to
Sorry. Yeah, more language matters when it comes to this. Multi-hops.
Yeah. So it's a repetitive hop, like say 5-6 hops on the same leg. But again, the coaching's critical where it's got to be max height, max effort, jump as high as you can because you really want to see them be able to absorb that load and then rebound and transfer that load back vertically again. So that's a number that we like and that we're playing with more and more. But like Russ said, comparing it more to ourself, to the testee, looking at a single leg versus the opposite side. And then a number I was really excited about when we started messing with this stuff like 2 years ago was rate of force development, so RFD. And I was like, that just sounds to me like that's everything we need to know. Now, everything we've been talking about so far today is really talking about rate of force development and springiness and explosiveness and power. So I was really hoping that rate of force development would be a great number. They'd be like, man, that's what I really want to know more than anything. But it turns out that the variability in rate of force development is so high that's very difficult that I haven't been able to, and we haven't been able to come up with any kind of consistent metric around it that it's a variable to use, and that's pretty consistent with what's being written out there as well. So
yeah, it might be that I think again, Hagen Dynamics would call it a fluffy measure. Like it might just be the variability of the nervous system, and if it's that variable, yeah, then it's what are we doing with it? I think we need to really kind of focus on reliability of person to person to judge them against themselves, and then what are some good ratios to judge them against normative data and averages. And then what's a measure that guides strategy? What's a measure that guides safety? And try and keep it simple. Because again, the problem with when you get into this space, it can be very complicated in a hurry. How do you simplify so that you influence an athlete? I think the human psychology part is not to be overlooked. We got to, that's why the most widely known measure is VERT, because it's psychologically interesting. It's like people are associated with, oh, my performance. What's your vert? I'm going to beat you with your vert height, with my vert height. Yeah. So I think that the psychology of change is really critical with all this.
Yeah, 100%. It's funny when you're working with a group or a team, they all want to know any of the numbers, how strong am I? How much stronger compared to somebody else, and like, well, that was 3,000 Newtons. Like, what the hell does that mean? So you really got to know your stuff to be like, because they want to know instantly, or like, how high did I jump? And this is the big conversation I think that's coming that I think might see change. Maybe we won't see change, I'm not sure, but I think on the counter movement jump, hands on hips, down and up, gives you a certain number. And if, athletes are used to seeing their vertical jump being displayed or discussed or comparing it to people they know in the world, I just mentioned Aaron Gordon's like in the 40s, your counter movement jump is not going to be as high. There's going to be a significant drop, several inches, probably 5 to 6, 8 inches less. And of course, it's going to be in centimeters in most of these systems when we look at the details, but it's going to be a decent drop, and athletes are going to be super frustrated by that. And they are frustrated by that because when we report to them, like, oh, that was your vert was this much with the counter movement jump. And they're like, dude, like, that's super low. It's only 16. Like, I thought I'd be like 24. Like, well, you might be 24 on a vertec with a jump and reach, and you take in all those variables. That's a very different number. Yeah. Although the goal was to measure the same type of performance of the athlete, was how well can you move your body weight off the ground in a vertical fashion, was the same test, but different when you take into account arm swing and the way you measure it. Now, these plate systems are using an algorithm to determine jump height based on hang time, relative to how much power you generated according to body weight. So there's a calculation they're doing to assume height, but that is more reproducible and more consistent than reaching up and trying to swipe at the vertec, though that has a tremendous psychological stimulus. Yeah, it's tremendous when it's by every half inch matters.
I was so frustrated when we first got the force platforms. I immediately tested myself, and I think I tested at like 18 inches. Like, no way. I got 28 inches on the vertec 10 years ago, and then I just did a force pad, some generic force pad, and it said 20, 27, 28 inches. I'm like, oh, I was thinking in the last 10 years I haven't lost anything. And then I do this force platform. I'm like, wait a minute. I lost 10 inches? How did that happen? And then, going back to like reach and the technology. So these cheaper force platforms, they're just not correct. I think that's the frustrating part is we're using technology. It's just not correct if it's like a jump pad, that jump pad that's purely based off of flight time and probably some, I don't know. I don't know the force pads on why they were so off, but the reach, the vert tech, and looking at your reach, it is a massive difference of maybe 20, 30, 35%. And I think that as everyone starts, because this testing is so affordable now, that I think this will become the mainstay and people kind of get used to these numbers. But
yeah, I think they're going to be different. There is a correlation between counter movement jump height and vertex jump height in traditional fashion. It's quite a long equation that we actually have it as part of our athlete profile. So when we share the report with the athlete, we show them what that would be through the mathematical equation, give them some idea relevant to what they're used to seeing. So they're like, oh, okay. I would normally jump 24 inches, but this thing's telling me I jumped 16 because I had my hands on my hips instead. It was a little bit different.
Now, at that same point, I just looked at this research of how the counter movement jump, whether it's hands on hips or arm swing, how that measures to approach jump, whether you want to think of like a court or volleyball net, and what kind of variability there is. And it's a massive amount of variability. They said anywhere up to like 30% of the power you can generate just off of your technique of how you create momentum with a few steps and propel yourself. And so correlated, meaning working on jumping power is always going to help, but it doesn't transfer immediately to now you can dunk. It's just a part of the equation. You still have to work on the skill of approach with that's more sport specific.
Yeah, I always love those verticals, frankly, as like a great measure. Is much more fun as an athlete to participate in, like the approach verticals, whether it be volleyball or basketball, the two you see it at the most in. And in the NBA, they do it in a cool way where they put the vertex like at the free throw line, and the athlete can go anywhere around the 3-point line to approach that. They have 15 feet radius essentially to approach that thing, and they can do it any way they want to. And some guys go backwards, some guys go forward. It's really interesting to see like the different strategies they utilize to get max height on it. But it's a great it's a good test. It's very relevant, But yeah, that doesn't exist yet with this type of a system.
Yeah.
So cool. So went through quite a bit of tests there. A lot of scientific conversation about this. And again, this has to come down to what's your actionable. So what are you going to do with this information that you take this data in, you learn something about the athlete? How's it going to change their programming? So I want to talk at a deeper level than programming or about programming that we probably have time to right now. But the concept when you're looking at programming an athlete would be the same thing we mentioned here in these categories. We have a mobility section of the program, we have explosiveness and strength section of the program, and then we have explosiveness, then we have strength as the third section. So we've got mobility, explosiveness, and then powers, or then strength. So we look at it in those sections. And when you line it up, there's different ways to put all this together, where you have, typically what we like to do in our program would be to have some mobility and warm up front, then have something highly skill driven, highly performance oriented, highly powerful. So you're maximizing the nervous system while the body's warmed up and ready to go. And as that system starts to fatigue a little bit, then we move into more of a strength-based strategy traditionally, and be kind of a pretty traditional programming scheme that we might work out, that we use, that we found to be incredibly safe, incredibly effective long-term, especially with developing athletes from the youth up through the college ages. I think as the athlete matures, or as their knowledge or their training age, if you will, increases, then I think you can kind of throw some of that around a little more and do some more things with either, supersetting or reorienting kind of your organization a little bit. I know you're always extremely creative with your training, usually working with like an MMA population.
Yeah, well, it's like a recipe. I do think of I'm not a great cook, but I think about it. I think having a simple recipe that you repeat, and then add some color here, add some variability here. I like juxtaposing that, or I like supersetting that. When we have a basic rubric, it allows you to really kind of build and iterate your own tastes, and then also customize it, because sometimes you might be working with a person who needs a simpler routine because their life is that busy, or their life is actually fairly simple and they can handle more complex routines. So I think customization comes from putting together simple recipes and building off it over time. But if you're speaking to teams, we got to think of logistics, schedule, show up. Do you have the right tools? I mean, it's amazing how many people focus on little things that do not move the needle rather than show up and do the right work. So I think making sure that these measures give us where the majority of the volume and intensity lie. I mean, I love a complex program because I like using my brain, but I also realize simple is highly effective if done well. And then once you can do simple well, you kind of earn to the next level of complexity.
100%. I think in watching the athletes that Russ is working with versus the athletes I might be working with, because I don't have as many fighters certainly as you do. I'm usually dealing with more of like a multi-directional athlete in soccer, football, or maybe track or basketball or something like that. But it's really interesting to watch. Like Russ will have really high intensity plyometric drills encompassed into a cardiovascular demanding sequence, because when an MMA fight, these guys have to be able to go for 5 minutes in most cases for multiple rounds. And if you start to break down, like, how does that athlete compete in that environment, there's this really consecutive cardiovascular component, always this base that's kind of burning. And then there's these moments of like maximum effort, just for maybe, 5 seconds to 30 seconds or so. And then there's always either a separation or a floor situation where everybody catches their breath and they kind of regroup within that 5-minute window. And then there's another rapid bout of so you see the training start to look like that. That's what we want to emulate in the arena, in that environment. And I think we have to be doing the same thing with the other athletes we train, whether it be, if it's a football guy, what position are they playing? Think about football as like a very, very force productive, very, very explosive if you're in the line for maybe 10 seconds at the most, probably more like 5 seconds. And then you have a 45-second rest period depending on what level you play at and then how long the clock is going for. And then there's a small cardiovascular component where you're going to play for maybe, a 10 to 15 play drive and have the ball for 10 minutes. So there's different things to think about. But if you're like a receiver, you might have a very explosive, like long sprint or 2 sprints, and they pull you out. You sit on the sideline for 2 minutes, totally recover, and then you're back in. So you're, rebuilding your creatine system, rebuilding your sugar systems, and you're ready to go right away. So cardiovascular demands are less, but explosiveness is very, very high. So you started thinking about, that's what we said earlier, style of play, and what's the goal you're bringing this athlete to. And when you're programming, you really want to appreciate that. What systems are they using cardiovascularly wise? What kind of athlete are they? Are they springy? Are they more concentric in power production? Or what's their strength like? Maybe use DSI here. Where's their strength relative to their power? Is they a strong athlete or are they a weaker athlete? And then, of course, what's their mobility like? You start taking all those variables into account and then determine what's their style of play. What is it they're trying to accomplish? And that's really the foundation of how you want to structure your program, in my opinion.
Here is I don't know why I had this imagery of Sherlock Holmes as you were talking. And I think I hear constantly...
Wasn't what I was going for.
Yeah, right. It's like picture Sherlock Holmes. But as you were talking, I could see so many young therapists say, well, I really don't train athletes, so I guess this knowledge is not really applicable to me because I don't really have any teams like Tony has. And before I trained athletes like I'm doing right now, I thought like this. And because I thought like this, I earned each year, I iterated. As soon as I had a 12-year-old athlete, I flexed my brain on that 12-year-old athlete. And that made my way to the 16-year-old athlete. And that made my way to, the MLS hopeful. And then that made my way to the college. And you keep building up this very detective mindset of appreciating the individual in front of you and all the individual needs and how would you measure success and be razor sharp. And when you actually just practice how to do this, it just means that you're being a good coach and a good physical therapist and you're doing the right thing, but you're also solving the right problem by not just accepting, but you're continuing to dive in. You're continuing to reflect of what yields success. And it is the thought process that guides that success, not one day you have all these pro athletes on your schedule. Now you better learn how to program them. So in other words, you don't learn from getting the athletes. You have to get your brain right. And it's great how they actually just all show up in line because you have a brain to help them.
Yeah. You don't have to know anything about the sport.
Yeah.
I mean, you should learn it quickly once you get the athlete in front of you. But you don't have to know anything about the sport to earn the right to work with them. You do have to show them as you are interested, that you're curious, like we talked about before, and that you have the knowledge within you to figure it out. And then when I met Stephanie for the she came with a tibial stress fracture. She was a discus thrower. I didn't know a thing about track and field, like at all. Like, I mean, at all, right? She threw the discus, and my brother-in-law is a thrower, as a matter of fact. He threw the shot and stuff. And I remember at some point he was talking about something that regarding, was it a spin or a glide type of technique? And I'm like, what are we doing? I was kind of, with it, but, wasn't super clear to me at the time. And so even with Steph, I'm like, so how do you throw it? Do you spin, or do you like slide forward? You glide? What do you do? And she's like, no, they glide in the shot, and the discus we spin. I'm like, oh, okay. Apparently it's a dumb question, But the point is that I looked at her and what she had to do with her leg, and then said, okay, what are the forces being put upon you, and what are the demands of your sport? And let's start to get you in a conditioning environment as soon as possible to match this. And as we went down that path, the first thing she said to me, like, once we got back into like a weight bearing situation and she got back into eventually competing and throwing, she's like, man, I'm in such a better position now. Like, I've learned so much from you and with the balance stuff you've done and the different positions you put me in to master this, that I can actually now, I'm competing better. So I want to continue to do this. Then we started breaking out other things. We started looking at the whole event. And to me, this was shocking. Like, the whole discus thing was shocking to me. Like, you go out there and you get like some warm up throws, and then you sit, like the round could be 30 minutes, 20 minutes at least. If there's like 15, 20 competitors, everybody gets about a minute, they walk in there and they do their little shenanigans and they like throw the thing. Then somebody's on deck, somebody's in the hole, then there's a deck, and they're just sitting. And I was like, how could you possibly be the max power athlete, like explosive, like let's go in 1 second, throw it as far as you can. You just sat for 25 minutes. What do you do to like re-warm yourself up? I was just asking questions, and she's like, well, I don't know. We just go through a few like warm-up drills. I'm like, no, that's not what you do. That's not okay. Like, we need to like do like some dynamic stuff, So we started implementing a little bit of a little warm-up again, and then a few plyometric things when she was fourth in the hole. And then when third in the hole, there were a few different activities. And second in the hole, she got to actually simulate her throw. And then on deck, she did another few simulations, a little mental preparation, and then, okay, pick it up and walk in the ring. And like working that out was something that lasted 10 years, And actually I saw the sport change, honestly, which was wild. And going to the Olympics and the World Championships and such over those years, I saw other athletes starting to like get up and move during their downtime versus everybody else just sitting there resting. I'm like, it was the craziest thing I've ever seen in sports. So I'm like, this is not a sport. It just isn't a sport. It is. It's a phenomenal sport. But I mean, I'm coming from like a basketball world or like a sweating world, and you guys are sitting. You stay with the road. Like, no wonder people talk about this with the connotations they do. But the point to all that story is that you can have tremendous impact as a coach, as a clinician, whatever your role is with your people by caring about it and asking them what's the goal, starting to understand what the demands are of their body, their sport, their activity. Any person doesn't have to be an athlete. And as you start to appreciate that, then that's really, you can take some of these numbers, start to understand the athlete better, and then really, really program something really, really effective for them. Thanks for watching KIMEcast and listening in. If you guys have any comments, if you have some questions, please fire away in the chat and post that to us. We'd love to respond and engage or answer some questions here in the future if those come through.